Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're going to be talking about something that I'm pretty passionate about, and that is accessibility. Now, we live in an incredibly diverse world full of so many types of users, and we can't assume that all users are going to experience our products in the same way. And here comes accessibility. And simply that is why it's so important. If one person can't actually use your designs or your product, you really have failed them. An accessible product is one where all your users can actually enjoy it. Unfortunately, when we design products, we always design for the majority of users in mind, which are users who do not experience any difficulty when using any type of product. In most cases, there is very little insight into designing individual components that will work for every user. Nobody ever thinks about the user who has function only in one hand, or a user who has trouble with hearing, or a user who has visual impairments. Accessible design aids in creating a better experience for everyone. It could be for somebody who has a permanent disability, or maybe a temporary disability, and even a situational impairment. Contrary to popular belief that accessible design is sacrificing the visual quality of your product, it does in fact make it better for every single user. Let's take a moment to think about our world. Think about ramps or sloped curbs. Now, they've been designed for helping those in wheelchairs get around. This isn't the only use though. Think about everywhere you have seen a ramped curb. Parents with strollers, people making deliveries with trolleys, people bike riding. It just makes our life that much easier. What about push to open buttons? They're installed in most stores, in most places, to aid people in wheelchairs. And if you were to think if they weren't installed in a place or an establishment, you'd think that that would be pretty odd. They help all of us when you have too many bags to carry or a child that can't really muster the strength to open the door by themselves. Also, sometimes it's just easier to use one. We shouldn't have the mindset that accessibility is a checklist or a set of requirements, but it should be ingrained in how we design. We should be designing for all people. Next, I'm going to talk about some assistive technologies. Let's talk about some assistive technologies. So, when people come to our site to use our products, those that have disabilities are typically using what's called an assistive technology, whether that's a device or software, and there's a wide range of them that are important to understand because it's going to open your mind to some of the ways that people are interacting with your content and the user experience you're creating online. So here are some of them. We have screen readers. Now, this is probably a more common one that we've all heard about, but it's a program that helps the visually impaired understand the content displayed on the web page. So it basically converts digital text and labels and images and descriptions to something that is more readable by this piece of software. So you could imagine that all they would need to do is press play and they could read like an entire block of text. They could read entire web pages. Something else people use are Braille terminals. Now, those who can't see that well or can't see at all use Braille terminals, and the round tip pins that come through the holes help blind people actually read and can see what's going on the screen. There's also something called a switch or some sort of tap control, which basically is like a joystick, or you can use the keyboard spacebar to do this. But essentially, as you tap on your trackpad or your keyboard, it will help you to navigate the screen. Again, this may not be the best experience, but it is a way that people are interacting with various pieces of our content, and we really need to take that into account. Next, we have screen magnification software, which kind of works like a magnifying glass on the screen, as you can see over here. It's not like what you would typically see when you hit, like a zoom on your browser. It's not that everything scales up at once. It's that the user has control over this little magnifier window inside of the software so that they can magnify certain elements or a section of the screen or a design of a website. And that reinforces the fact that, all the elements of our design should be scalable. So you can see over here, he has this section actually magnified so he can read it easily. And lastly, what I have here are alternate input software and devices. As you can imagine, there's also speech input software, which is a lot different than Alexa or Google Home, but basically it allows people to control the computer with their voice. There's also devices like we see here with a keyboard, and the gentleman over here is using a stick to actually type. So once again, we need to take into account all the different ways people are interacting with our website, because it will affect the way we approach designing it and developing it. Hey, and welcome back. We're going to talk about visual patterns for accessibility. There's several things we can do as designers to really make our designs accessible. And also, there's things that we can do as designers and to influence developers to ensure that our products, our live products, are actually accessible. So let's jump right in. The first thing is color contrast. Now, this is the first step towards an accessible UI, and it's to get the color contrast for your product right. Color contrast is a really important part when it comes to visual impairments. So getting this right will help those with visual impairments to see and to discern information on the screen. You'll notice over here, there's a little screenshot I took from a tool that I use called ColorSafe that actually shows you the current ratio of your contrast and the goal ratio. So this is AA compliant, and all these colors can help you pick a palette that would actually be compliant. So what does that contrast ratio mean? Now, the recommended contrast is 3:1 for large text and 4.5:1 for small text. This is the readability from the difference between the foreground and background color. Larger font is categorized by any font larger than 18 pixels when bold, or larger than 24 pixels for regular font weight. Small text is anything smaller than 18 pixels. So you'll notice over here, you could do it with UI components as well, and we'll get into the different areas where we can essentially use these as guidelines rather than rules, because sometimes certain contrast ratios don't necessarily work as well as we would think they do, but it's totally up to you. Use your best intuition and test. So here are some of the tools that I actually use. ColorSafe is a great tool if you're starting a project fresh and you want to choose colors and check their contrast ratios before you actually make a palette. And in some products that have an established color system or a set of brand colors, you'll need to find contrast ratios that work from the product's palette. And what I usually use for that is another site called Colorable. I'll just input the colors there, and it'll tell me if they are compliant with those standards. There are some Figma plugins as well that are really helpful if you don't want to use a browser, and I'll show you those later. Now, there are alternate ways to improve contrast, and sometimes it can be a really large task to check each of your foreground and background color combinations. An easy way to run through a test to find any issues with your designs is to use a Chrome tool called Color Contrast Analyzer. So this is another tool that I use. There are multiple types of Chrome extensions out there, but I like this one best because what it does is it essentially identifies areas that will require work on the screen. Areas outlined in white maintain good contrast, and areas with poor contrast have subtle outlines that aren't as prominent. So this is a good way to get a good understanding if your current design is accessible at all. The next thing we can do is proper labeling. I know it sounds kind of boring and rudimentary, but labeling can go a long way, especially with screen readers as they're jumping around the screen. Your developers probably know a lot about this already, but designers don't adhere to proper labeling. And it's an easy thing that we can all do to make things a bit more accessible. And what I mean by that is that when you're designing a form, rather than having a placeholder inside the input and which possibly acts as the input's label, just have your label be a label. You could have a placeholder that then on focus acts as a label, but a placeholder that goes away upon focus is a huge no-no, not only for user experience, but for accessibility. So labels on top like this and as a separate element are a really great way to go and achieve that. And then there's also menu labels. So think about like a hamburger menu. A lot of people use hamburger menus for hiding menus on mobile, which makes a lot of sense. If you're going to use a menu icon, then you should have some other indicator because the icon alone isn't necessarily accessible unless it's being properly coded. And things like icons, even though you can put a title in the code to help screen readers actually read them, it's a better practice to put a label beside an icon or any sort of menu icon. Now let's jump into Figma to talk a little bit about the tools I use. Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to be talking about some of the tools that I use to check color contrast and to make my designs a bit more accessible. Then we'll jump quickly into Figma to debunk some things around our contrast ratios being a rule rather than a guideline. So let's take a look at Color Safe over here. So this is Color Safe. It'll allow me to pick color palettes based off of my goals. And let's just jump in and get started and I'll show you what that means. So I'm going to click Get Started, and right here we can set up our canvas and our text. So I can set up background colors, I can set up font families, all the font size, font weights. I can even set up standards. You can go and learn more at the website over here, but typically we're aiming for AA standards. And this is what the text would look like. I think this is fine to just get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Generate Color Palette. So what this does is it generates a ton of color palettes based off of different colors like green, blue, purple. You can also sort by all, and you'll be able to see all of the contrast applicable colors. So what I can do here is I can pick this purple, and you'll notice that the current ratio meets the AA standard. I get a little hex value here that all I need to do is click on and it copies to my clipboard, and I can bring that right into Figma and start creating a color palette based off of some colors that I've picked, which is really cool. You can see that this one's been copied. You can see all these other ones over here, which is really great. And you can just start over if you want to go back and set up that canvas again. Now the next tool I like to use is called Colorable. Now I just love this interface. It's just nice, it's punchy, and what's really nice and cool about it is that you can see if it's AAA compliant or AA compliant right at the top. You don't necessarily need to set anything, you can just jump right in and start fiddling away. If you have a couple of colors that you already have in mind, it's a great way to just kind of input them right away. Another thing is, like, if you really want to just fiddle around with colors, this is probably the best tool to do so. So you can see like white on this very light sky blue fails in all aspects. And you'll see that it still keeps on failing probably until we get a little darker. So you can see this is good for larger text and smaller text. And now it's AAA compliant. So this is another really cool tool. What you can also do is you can reverse these, and you can see what it looks like reversed when you reverse the foreground and the background colors. So this is an awesome tool if you want to fiddle around with colors really quickly or test a color or hex code that you have in mind. Now, what I typically use are Figma plugins because it's just so quick for your actual workflow. The main Figma plugin that I actually use is called Contrast. So I'll bring that up right now. So I have a couple of buttons here, and I'm going to show you how that works with contrast. But what I really want to show you is that these buttons are actually accessible. And you know, they are readable, and but I think that they're not the greatest. So I'll show you what that looks like. So all I need to do is I need to select this text inside this frame, and it'll show me exactly here if it meets the contrast standards. You'll see the foreground and background, and it meets all the standards right across the board. Let's see, even with the orange. Same thing, it'll show you the contrast ratio here as well. And I find this is like the quickest way to just test your designs, even when you're just creating concepts. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually create a duplicate over here, and I'm going to show you what it looks like with white. So I'm going to change that. And another great thing about this is that it's going to update on the fly. So let's go and pick white. The color hex code for that is FFF for short form, or 6 Fs. Now what we got here is that it totally fails. The contrast ratio is not good enough, and I think it's going to fail as well for the orange. Let's change that. And yeah, it does fail here for the orange. The contrast is just a bit better than it is on the blue. Oh, actually, no, it's just a bit better, just a tad. So let's just close this plugin. And if you notice, I feel like I can read the white on the blue better than I can read the black on the blue. And so this is going to come down to you testing with your users because those are guidelines and you don't necessarily need to follow them like they're law. So take that into account when you're designing and coming up with color palettes or intended uses for your colors, because there may be a case like this where a white on a blue may actually be really readable and it doesn't necessarily meet a contrast standard. So keep that in mind. Another plugin is Stark, which is pretty popular. All you need to do is like check contrast. So I need to select a layer. So I'm gonna select that layer and check the contrast really quickly. So you can see that it comes up right away. You can upgrade and pay, but I mean, I feel like this does it much better. Color, where is it? Contrast right here. This plugin is much better just because you can do it on the fly. You don't need to keep on selecting it or closing it, or you don't even need to pay for it. So this is a great way to check what colors will work right on the fly. So like I said over here, keep that in mind. These are guidelines. They aren't necessarily law. So use what is best for you and what's best for your users. And yeah, that's basically it for the tools that I use to check my contrast. So let's talk about focus states. Focus is one of the most important features that enables users to use a computer with just a keyboard. Most style sheets will have this one piece of code that will cause major accessibility failure. And this is it. Yep, removing the outline. So let's go back just a bit. That would remove this outline, which is horrible. Don't ever do this, ever. You should avoid doing this like the plague. Keyboard users will know what element they're interacting with because of the help of focus styles. So focus highlighting is only used for interactive UI elements like form elements and buttons, so we need to make sure that we keep that in there. Another thing we should always be thinking about is focus contrast. It's a guideline to have the color of your outline adhere to contrast standards as well. So if you look over here, we have an orange outline, and that is definitely going to be accessible. There is enough contrast with that white background, but if you were to have a very light gray, that's just not going to work. Next is to think about off-screen content in relation to focus. Keep in mind that sometimes we design content that is hidden off the screen, kind of like this menu over here in this example. Some of this content could be like hamburger menus, modals, etc. Sometimes when a user is tabbing through focus points, they can lose track because it could be highlighting something off screen. Could you imagine how confusing that could be for a user? If I was tabbing through something like this and I was picking up navigation items, super confusing. This would cause so much confusion and the user could lose track of what they're doing on screen. Speak with a developer about solutions around this. But if you're feeling comfortable enough, you can do this easily with CSS or JavaScript. Next is modals. Modals can be an accessibility disaster when not done properly. When users tab through a modal like this, they should be confined to just the modal. They should never be focusing on content behind. So could you imagine if I was tabbing through modal title, the exit button, whatever content's within on these buttons, and then all of a sudden I tap through launch demo modal, I would be pretty confused and lost. So make sure you have that conversation as well with developers. Now, hover states also apply to focus, and hover states should be made accessible. Users should be able to tab through hover areas as they do with focus-based areas, because sometimes we actually hide certain interactions under a hover state. Think about Facebook and their reactions. You need to hover over that like button before you can see all the other reactions. But Facebook does a great job with making this accessible. You can actually tab through this as a focus state, which is amazing. Let's talk about click targets. Now, a big thing is cards. Cards are used a bunch in products these days, and it's important to create accessibility-friendly cards since they can get so complex with multiple states based on the type of interaction being performed. A really good example of how cards can be made accessible is through Google Inbox. Now, if you take a look at over here, this is Google Inbox, and this interaction is really great. So they assign specific focus states to the So they assign specific focus states for the cards that the user has navigated to. So you'll notice that the person here is navigating to all these different cards, and then you can see that this is the card that they're currently on. The hover action is completed on focus. So the hover action over here, for all the different actions you can take on an individual inbox item, will be highlighted while you tab through, which is also great. Now, another thing that people fail to realize is you don't necessarily need to make every single UI element on the screen tabbable or focusable. What Google Inbox does really well in this specific interaction is that only the actionable items are focused and not every other element in the card. So over here, you'll notice that only these primary actions are actually in focus in comparison to like all these other elements. Next is target areas. We need to make sure that target areas are large enough for users to select on a page. So some users have motor impairments and find it hard to select smaller items. If we take a look over here, we'll notice that the mailbox has a larger tappable area. Same with what the edit button would be. And this is what I was talking about in the beginning around like different, that accessibility is greater for all. I mean, when you're on mobile, you want a larger tappable area, and not even if you have a motor impairment. This just makes my life easier as just going through my mailbox. So keep this in mind just when you're designing in general. Now, I just want to say that many of these solutions aren't very style specific, but they do all still affect us in some way, especially as designers. We always set out to build products that everyone can enjoy and use easily. Accessibility should be a part of the design process earlier, and every UI element and every design pattern should be made accessible. And most importantly, you should always collaborate with your development team. Accessibility is something that all of us can work towards and do. And it certainly starts with design in terms of style, like contrast and labels and forms and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of what happens in terms of specifications will happen on the development side. So it's always important to talk to developers because they're going to have a much deeper understanding of what's really necessary. And they can really inform you and help you along the way. So that's accessibility.